when we can't put our own food security in place, where we can't think about Canadians who live in rural coastal areas, when we can't think about reconciliation and Indigenous communities and leaders who want to have their own economic self-determination, but we're more impressed with votes in certain regions to keep in power, we've got a problem in our hand that's a lot bigger than salmon farming.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a national think tank based in Ottawa. And I'm checking in today here from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I'm here today with Linda Sams, who works at Cermak, one of Canada's leading salmon farming companies. She's been an expert in this field for a very long time and has some incredible perspectives on an industry that holds enormous potential for Canada, but is almost also under existential threat. We want to talk a little bit about the threat, but most importantly, Linda, we'd like to really talk about sort of what the industry is and how it's evolved over time. And then talk a little bit about why people are sort of trying to push to have it closed down and why it's important that it be sustained. So, Linda, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. Really looking forward to it.
Oh, it's going to be wonderful. Everybody I talk to talks about how important you are to this sector. How you've been involved in so many different ways. So I wonder if you could just give me a really quick summary of your experience in the fish salmon farming industry. How you got to be where you are today.
Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll make it quick, but I grew up in a farm in the Fraser Valley, so farmer at heart. But I was also very interested in science and went off to university and did my degrees in marine biology and environmental toxicology. This was the 80s. And then salmon farming, which they called mariculture then, was just emerging as something exciting. And again, I think because of my farming background, I was interested in that. And yeah, I guess 1987, started in my first role with a company that's no longer around, but a Canadian company, Royal Pacific Sea Farms, and started farming Chinook and coho. And as the decades progressed, moved into other species and then Atlantic salmon. Did a stint running the BC Centre for Aquatic Health Sciences, and then was headhunted to go over to Australia to work with Tassal, the largest salmon farming company over there. There for 10 years, technical job as well as sustainability and environmental management. So I've done every aspect of the business, from site managing to freshwater directing to hatcheries to the science, the environmental, on and on and on. So long career.
So let's start at the very beginning. You mentioned the fact that you were a farmer in the Valley, and you consider yourself a farmer now. So let's recognize the fact that many people listening to this will not see aquaculture or salmon farming as farming. So just explain why you use that phrase. It's very common in the sector. But explain why that phrase is used.
Absolutely. It's about growing food. It's about having stock, which you look after from birth to harvest. It's about managing quite often large number of animals in our case. And it's about managing animal welfare and its predictability of harvest and being able to deliver wholesome, healthy food year round in a consistent way to a marketplace, and always constantly improving your practices. So in any farming, dairy, chickens, beef, you're always looking at improving your practices, improving your profitability, because we are businesses, but also tailoring your approach and your animals and your nutrition to the general public and your consumer. So you control every aspect of this operation, unlike wild commercial catch, where of course they have quality control and they manage their their gear and managing their harvest that follow permits, but they don't control the actual life cycle of the seafood that they're catching. So this is very much farming, and it's how we moved from deer to Herefords, right? It's that being able to control your supply and have access to food 24/7 all year round, right? So that's it.
So I'm really puzzled by that.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful description. But for some reason, we have no trouble with considering raising chickens to be agriculture. We have no problem thinking about hogs or worrying about beef, cattle, or anything like that. We now have ostriches and llamas and all these other things that we all consider to be part of the agriculture sector. What is it about salmon fishing, the salmon farming, that has made it sort of put into a different category? It seems to me it's very similar.
Yeah, well, it actually is, but we're still relatively new. I mean, when you think about how long we've been farming terrestrial animals, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, not thousands of years, versus salmon farming that's been here, for less than 100 years. So, and far less than 100 years. So that is part of it. I think it's still understanding that farming the ocean was a novel and exciting idea in the 80s. That was the whole Jacques Cousteau movement. We will farm the ocean. And as a young person entering into my career, I was really excited about that because I felt it was an incredibly sustainable and important way to feed the planet as we continue to grow rapidly and manage a dwindling resource, be it land, water, or even where we were getting our food from locally. And here was something we could do in British Columbia and Canada with our massive coastline and our ability to tread lightly in the marine environment because we had so much room and space. So it was a tremendous opportunity. And again, not just salmon. Like when I started, I was keen on everything, shellfish, seaweed, all these things showed tremendous opportunities, but it was the Atlantic salmon that really built the backbone of this industry in Canada because of its productivity and its, you could count on that you were going to have a product every year on year that was actually going to have a good margin. And of course, that's important.
So Linda, I've had the good fortune of being able to travel a fair bit. And I remember one time flying into Taipei in Taiwan. And as you're flying in from the airport, all you see is a whole series of what look like swimming pools. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of them. And so you were landing down, what is this? It looks, I thought they were rice farms initially. I thought, well, they had a lot of water in them and things like that. So I landed and immediately sort of started asking people what it was. Found a tourist information site where they said, oh, that's simple. Those are the fish farming pools. And he said, that's where we get most of our fish from. And then I've had the good fortune to be over in Norway a lot, and also the Faroe Islands and places like Scotland and stuff like that. Salmon farming there is seen as sort of a very logical extension of sort of the local economic development. So if you can, tell me why in British Columbia it has become so incredibly controversial.
Well, I don't know if I can tell you because I think we're, as an industry, are still trying to understand that riddle ourselves and still fail to understand why it is such a struggle for us to gain public acceptance for salmon farming, which we should be very proud of. And we have not even begun to tap into the potential that we could bring to the coast of BC, for instance, but to all of Canada, the economic prosperity, the food security, and the ability for us to be able to diversify into even other species. So, but, to look back on it historically, the resource industries got hit hard by activism in the late 80s, early 90s, forestry, mining, even commercial fishing at some point too had critics. And we were the new kid on the block. And so as some of these industries either started to stumble or fail and not be as prominent as they were, or had worked out agreements, the attention turned to us. So that was part of it. And we were ill-equipped to respond. We were naive. We were focused, again, being farmers, kind of just put our head down and said, well, we'll just farm, we'll do an excellent job, we'll do an excellent product, and people see we're farmers, and this will be okay. But obviously that was the wrong approach. So we had to learn, and we had catch up on that. The other part was conflict around Indigenous rights and title. And many early farms were put in when it was an era where there was little to no consultation with the nations in the territories where the farms were put. And that caused conflict as well. And that could have been done better, obviously. I mean, but that is something that is similar across natural resource industries and farming across the board. However, it did lend to the controversy. And, there's information out there that showed that we were a threat to commercial fishing in a lot of Alaska, for instance, that there were some, focuses on funding and seeing things that would undermine the industry in BC. I'm on the fence on that one. I don't disbelieve it. I mean, I can't believe that it was true, but obviously it was a much bigger issue than that, and a real reflection of social unrest about shared spaces in the marine environment. Yeah.
I mean, it's such an interesting thing because I see it that way very much. That it's one of these classic conflicts over the commons in terms of
Yes.
who controls the fish. You have the fact that the fish are sort of hatched in the rivers of British Columbia, but also down in Oregon and Washington, migrate up into the North Pacific and come back down. And who catches them and who catches how many? We've been fighting over this for a very long time. But I'm also sitting here in Saskatchewan, where farming is the foundation of our economy in very good ways. And I'm a huge fan of farming in all of its respects, including fish farming. But I'm always intrigued in Saskatchewan, where there are known ecological effects of farming. Any kind of human activity on the land or on the water has an effect. And just a question of, can you mitigate them? Can you control them? Can you prevent them? Can you offset them in some ways? And when I watch the sort of the criticism that the salmon farming industry gets, which is intense, and then compare that to the lack of criticism of prairie agriculture and prairie ranching, which is even more destructive in some ways. So it's really more impactful. I'm just really puzzled by that. I actually think it has a lot to do. It's kind of like on the East Coast. Bridget Bardot did not go and hug the lobster. She went and hugged a baby seal. Salmon are iconic. And how can you possibly do anything to even threaten or worry the poor salmon, because they're such a foundational species for the West Coast?
Yes, I think there's a lot of emotions. And actually, I was going to raise that next. And I think you're absolutely right. It is an iconic species culturally, spiritually. It's last seen as a wild frontier. It's seen, it represents, and importantly, and rightly so, represents a lot of important emotions and cultural history for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And so anything, I hesitate, but I'm going to say it. We were a bit of an easy target because you could play on people's emotions, like you said, with Bridget Bardot and the seal hunt, right? And those emotions are legitimate. So I would never say the emotions are not correct. The emotions are correct. It's the facts that support it. The information that was being put out was not always correct, and there was always, the means justify, or the ends justified the means. And so that was challenging for us. And there's a lot of technical and scientific people in our industry. And so we're kind of black and white. And we say, well, but no, here's the information, here's the data that supports it, here's the actual facts. So really it's okay. That is not how you work in these sorts of situations, which was a hard lesson, which we learned over time. But
and we didn't very often, you don't very often look for comparative examples. And it'll really temporarily go back to the business of the seal hunt. And the seal hunt ended up in a very large protest where the Europeans banned the importation of seal products. And I very much remember Inuit leaders going over to England in particular, but also to Germany and other places, and saying, this is our livelihood. We hunt the seals. We sell the pelts. The pelts give us money to buy bullets and give us money to buy our gasoline and fix our motors.
Yeah.
We use that to buy food. It is a central piece. And the message that came back over in Europe was, well, we don't care. We're interested in seals. Well, they were interested in baby seals. But if we're harvesting mature seals, but the distinction was lost very quickly.
Yeah.
And whole communities were destroyed economically as a consequence. Just talk about that for a little second here. I mean, you mentioned very early on, farmers in all their different manifestations are the centerpiece of their local communities. Without the farmers there, the ranchers, without the grain farmers, you do not have the towns and whatever else. I'm assuming that the same thing holds for salmon. I know the same thing holds for salmon farming, that you're actually pivotal to the survival of a whole bunch of communities along the coast of British Columbia.
Absolutely. And in ways that are not always easily apparent. And I would like to, again, emphasize that our industry and Sir Mac in particular, because that's my intimate knowledge of our operations, are committed to working in territories with First Nations where we have protocol agreements and we're welcome. So that's the communities first that we have to think about. And obviously we're obliged to consider and think about under UNDRIP. And we embrace that. In fact, we run towards it because those are governments that we have really, really found success working with. And a lot of the shared success comes from shared values around community and around local prosperity and diversification of prosperity and supporting economic diversification. So I just want to say that first and foremost. And then beyond that grows prosperity for the other community that surrounds either Indigenous communities or we're all part of the same community, such as in Campbell River or in Tofino. And we have roles that people don't often understand, like during the winter season when we don't have tourism, our shopping at the local grocery store or the co-op is a sustaining, important practice for affordable food or for diversity of food that's coming into the community, for example. That's in smaller communities. In places like Campbell River, where we have a lot of our service and supply chain located, not all of it, because we have that across BC and in the Lower Mainland, but specifically in Campbell River as another example. Yes, we're a bigger community and we have other resource industries here. However, the money and services that get developed here and the money that gets put into them to sustain them from our industry, from marine mechanics to docks to boat yards to nets, there's just a long list, transport trucks, BC ferries. There's just so many things that people don't see right away. But those first dollars that come from our industry play a really important fabric of infrastructure for our economy in these local rural coastal communities. North Island on the west coast and Tofino, Port Alberni, right, for us. And, obviously Port Hardy, the other companies have operations in other small communities. So it is a network of synapses through the North Island and rural coastal areas that they're getting cut off. And nobody wants to see people feeling that, but unfortunately now I'm witnessing in my community people feeling it. And it's actually very sad. It's really tragic.
Well, it really is. I mean, one of the things that I live part of my year on the coast of British Columbia, and I visit Campbell River and Tofino, up island, Port Hardy all the time. Beautiful, beautiful places. But you follow the pattern there. In the summertime, they're very busy. Lots of people go on tourist trips. They want to go and see the grizzly bears. They want to go fishing for sports fishing and things like that. And it looks very, very busy. And then you go off season, which is more than half the year. And the kind of fish farms are one of the only things going. And one of the things that people forget is that the commercial forestry has been cut back dramatically. It's nowhere near as large as it used to be. And commercial fishing is much, much smaller. When I first came down to the area in the 1970s, the fleets going out of these places were enormous, and they've been cut way back. So you're looking not just at you're looking at a region. People love it like crazy. They want to live there. Beautiful place, beautiful environment, but it's kind of hard to hold on if you keep knocking away the underpinnings of the economy. So I'm intrigued here that salmon farming has been established successfully all around the world. It's not as though we're the only ones to discover this. It's the only place using Atlantic salmon. Obviously,
Yeah,
Norway is a huge example. So is Chile. So is Tasmania. You mentioned being down in
yeah,
Australia. Um, what are the scientific issues? I mean, seems to me that there's whatever you do, if there's a problem, the industry has tried to respond to that problem fairly expeditiously. So
yeah,
maybe you can start by just give me a couple of examples of how the industry's evolved in response
yeah.
to the ecological concerns.
Yeah, we would happy to. And first, let me start by saying that the problems aren't as big anywhere else in the world as they are perceived to be here in British Columbia. So yes, challenges happen in other countries, but I can tell you they are not amplified and vilified the way they are here in BC. I really have not seen anything like here. So I just think that's important to note. Yes, saner heads prevail, collaboration happens, conservation groups work with industry works with the government works with the conservation groups, Indigenous groups work together, and solutions are found. And through it, respect is maintained. We have a different situation in British Columbia. However, having said that, we have a couple things happening to us here in BC. And one of them is common to the world, and one of them can be particular to BC, and that is the viability and the challenge for wild salmon, right? So that's happening around us with many, many factors, which even our opponents now are forced to admit are bigger factors than anything a salmon farm can pose as a risk. So that's happening right around us. We are also seeing climate change happen right around us. So the ocean is changing rapidly. So those are two important, bookmarks to keep in mind when I talk about challenges, because we have to be very nimble. And the research that we have done on diseases and vaccines that we've developed has been very, very effective. In fact, I think the stat, excuse me, is around 3% through the whole production cycle of our fish are lost to any kind of infectious disease. That's very small for any kind of farming that is done on any kind of traditional farm. So that is really, really great. However, we have changing ocean conditions around us that are causing stress to our fish, not necessarily to wild fish. And so those where some of our other losses happen. We've done a tremendous amount of research on sea lice. You don't have to look very hard to find all the data and information that shows that traditionally our salmon farms have not created an untoward risk to wild salmon around sea lice. Sea lice naturally occurring. Wild salmon have it on them. Changing ocean conditions have contributed issues. But having said that, we did go through a period where we saw increasing numbers of sea lice on our fish. Through innovation and research, we have managed that to a very low level now in a housed territory, like extremely low. And we're using mechanical innovation. We're not using any kind of chemicals or drugs at this point to deal with those issues. But we have a very effective in-feed treatment available to us, which we now are able to use again because we've been relying really heavily on mechanical delousing. So job done on that. And I think we've done a good job. And of course, the wild fish monitoring in that area reflects it. Pathogens, we have very sophisticated tools now for monitoring. We understand what we are dealing with in the ocean, and we are well equipped to adapt quickly to keep the threat of disease down. And we work very collaboratively internationally and locally on any of these issues. Again, very manageable. Ecological biodiversity. One of the sciences we understand really well is waste assimilation from our farms and how to managing that so we do not have a biodiversity impact. And there's just, so much detail to all of this. But, we all have scientists on staff, veterinarians on staff, environmental management experts on staff, not to mention all the people we work with outside of our organizations. We are well poised and very to really be a sustainable industry here going forward. We don't put our heads in the sand. We look for risk. We look for issues. We monitor around us. The really exciting area where I see us going forward is around digitization of our data, AI, and understanding the broader oceanographic conditions so that we can actually work in a really harmonious way with the ocean which we're in. Because if you look way back to the 80s, where we had this view of this brave new world of farming and ways to provide a sustainable protein through aquaculture, that was the concept. We would use the ocean's energy. We would use a natural environment. Our fish would be free range because that's what they are when they're out in the open ocean at normal densities. They're actually experiencing a life, although it's freedom within boundaries, but experiencing a life that would be very similar to what they would experience in the wild. And if you love wild salmon and if you love animals, you would understand that be able to create a farming environment like that is probably the dream of every farmer, right? Because you are able to provide them with a life which is quite satisfactory for them. And so that's, anyhow, sorry, I can go on because I'm passionate about what we do. And I feel that it isn't broken. Can we improve things? Yes, of course. Do we take criticism? Yes, of course. Do we need strong regulatory environments? Yes, of course. But we have so much opportunity still as a nation, as an industry. Australia is a great example of that.
We're finding that Australia is a great example of many good things that we're sort of turning our backs on in interesting ways. And I see the potential of this industry is really quite dramatic. And we're starting to see it growing a bit more on the East Coast. It started on the West Coast for a longer period of time. And you sort of wish them well over there. Interestingly, on the East Coast, they're regulated by the provincial government. And on the West Coast, they're regulated by the federal government, which again was a function of the sort of the political turmoil and the activism and things of that sort. Maybe just wrap up. This has been just fantastic. It's exactly what I was hoping to get from you. So I appreciate that so much. What was the reaction when the government announced the ban in the summer of 2024? Government comes out and says 5 years, you got to shut it all down.
Yeah, we were blindsided, and I literally felt sick when that came out because it was such poorly informed policy. Apparent to me, this is Linda, just speaking as Linda, very politically driven. And I was disappointed in our country. I couldn't even begin to tell you because I knew what that was going to mean on the ground.
Right.
And it was going to mean human suffering. I lived through shutdowns of mines and forestry in these communities and had witnessed the families breaking apart, the suicides, the people losing businesses, for what? For political positioning. And I believe that's what we saw then. So my first reaction was extreme disappointment in our government. But getting through that, what the first things that were apparent to us was this policy was not informed by any kind of technical expertise. It was not underpinned by science or any kind of objectivity. And what we learned as we moved through the court system, in some of our appeals, in some of the decisions that were made, that these policies were written in opposition to recommendations coming out of the most senior bureaucracy that were the experts in our industry and in our environmental performance. So that was, again, alarming. Something was broken in our country. And I have to say, when we can't put our own food security in place, where we can't think about Canadians who live in rural coastal areas, when we can't think about reconciliation and Indigenous communities and leaders who want to have their own economic self-determination, but we're more impressed with votes in certain regions to keep in power, we've got a problem in our hand that's a lot bigger than salmon farming and we just happened to be, the catalyst to expose some of that. So, yeah, it was devastating for us, and we're still trying to find out if we can survive.
Well, and I hope we can, because I
Yeah,
think the industry, all industries have a bit of a footprint. And the question is, how do you keep it as small as possible, moderate and mitigate and do that sort of thing? And I actually see the problem as being much more systemic. I do a lot of research on the East Coast and with the lobster fishery and things like that. And the lobster fishermen out there, native and Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, basically think that Ottawa is like 30,000 miles away. They don't understand what happens on the ground or on the water. And I see this very much, the situation with the salmon farming, as a sort of an urban-rural, urban-small-town divide. The folks who can go down to the Granville Island market and buy wonderful Norwegian salmon, farm salmon, don't want to have that developed in their own backyard. But of course, city people, they're wonderful. They contribute a lot to Canada, but they are disconnected from where we get our food or when we get our wood or we get our minerals. So when I watch what goes on, there's similarities to what's happened in the oil and gas industry, to mining, to the East Coast fishing, that sort of thing. Just is a sign that sort of we haven't really allowed knit together the parts of Canada, the consumer parts and the producer parts. And when I just spent a couple of days with the fishermen from the Maritimes back at a meeting in Ottawa, and they actually sound very much like you. People don't understand the industry. They don't understand what we're doing. They don't respect our knowledge. They don't respect our input. They sort of have us all as caricatures, as stereotypes, rather than understanding us as people who are part of the process. So this then has been a fabulous sort of introduction to your career, which is quite a remarkable one, but also to an industry that is struggling to survive, not because of the environment, not because of the ecology, not because of global markets, not because of demand. All those things are in place. This is a collapsing or facing collapse because of government policy, poorly made policy, which is such an unexpected thing to see. We would think the governments are working to sort of prop up good and sustainable industries rather than the opposite. So I wish you well, and I thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Ken.